One snowy evening, a little girl asked her grandmother about the legend of the snow. The grandmother replied that it was a very long story, but the girl couldn't fall asleep. So, the grandmother began the tale, with scissors. Indeed, it was a long story, as the grandmother reminisced about something that happened long ago. There once lived a famous inventor in a quiet town, known for creating numerous remarkable inventions. But the most peculiar thing he ever made was a male figure with scissors for hands. What made it even more unusual was that he gave the figure a brain to think and a heart to feel. Sadly, the inventor passed away before he could complete the creation. The figure was named Edward. One sunny day, a woman dressed in purple coordinated attire was going door to door around town, trying to sell her line of cosmetics. Desperately looking for potential customers, she ended up at Edward's eerie-looking mansion on a hill. Surprisingly, despite its ghastly appearance, the estate had the most breathtaking landscaping. She knocked on the front door, but let herself in when no one answered. Taking the creaky, horrifying stairs, she searched for the house's owner. Her search led her to the attic with a damaged roof, where she noticed several memorabilia displayed on one of the walls. As she heard soft noises, she turned around and saw a dark silhouette in the corner. Frightened, she stepped back, but the figure gently approached. Not realizing her fear, Edward reached his hands out to her. Seeing that he meant no harm, the woman curiously studied him and asked about his parents. Edward innocently replied that his father never woke up one day. She lightly touched Edward's face with a cotton pad soaked in astringent. Then, she brought Edward to her home. Upon arrival, Peg took him into the living room, where many family photos were displayed. Edward instantly fell in love at first sight when he saw a picture of her daughter. Peg then took him to another room and asked him to change clothes. While trying to do so, Edward accidentally punctured a hole in the waterbed. He also struggled to dress himself. Eventually, Peg returned and helped him get dressed properly. Meanwhile, outside the house, the nosy neighbors had begun to gather after noticing Peg with a strange man in her car. That night, Edward joined the family for dinner. The family couldn't take their eyes off him, both out of fear and fascination. Edward awkwardly fumbled with the food, struggling to eat with his scissor hands. Later, Peg tucked him into bed, where he fell asleep warmly and peacefully. The next day, while the neighborhood husbands were at work, Peg spent time concealing the scars on Edward's face. Her husband, meanwhile, was trimming the backyard plants when Edward appeared and shaped one of the bushes into a dinosaur. He continued shaping others, impressing Peg and her husband. But their peace was interrupted when a woman appeared in their yard, screaming that Edward came straight from the pits of hell. She fled in fear when Edward tried to approach her. Soon after, Peg opened the front door to find a group of curious neighbors insisting on having an afternoon barbecue to meet the mysterious guest. Edward helped Peg prepare by chopping ingredients. However, when Peg opened a can of pineapples, Edward zoned out into a daydream about his father's invention. In his memory, he saw the machines in the mansion preparing meals and his father joyfully working on projects. It was in that moment the idea of Edward, with scissors for hands, was born. At the backyard barbecue hosted by the Boggs family, neighbors admired their garden, unaware Edward had trimmed it. While some of the men quietly mocked Edward, one kindly advised him never to let anyone make him feel handicapped just for being different. The women, on the other hand, fed him by hand, since Edward couldn't use utensils. That night, Edward dreamed again, this time about being in the mansion's laboratory, where his father read him boring stories and funny poems. Outside, Kim had just arrived home from a camping trip with her boyfriend and his friends. When Kim entered her room, she screamed after seeing Edward reflected in her mirror. Equally frightened, Edward jumped, accidentally puncturing the waterbed again. Kim ran to her parents' room in panic and Peg calmed her down. Bill then offered Edward a different room to sleep in and gave him a drink of rum, sharing stories about Kim's teenage years. Edward drank the rum through a straw and quickly became intoxicated. Peg later introduced a woozy Edward to Kim, who watched in shock as he fainted on the floor. The next day, Esmeralda, one of Edward's fans, invited him to trim her garden. He created swans out of the bushes, but when she offered him lemonade, he declined and vomited instead. After finishing her garden, Edward visited Kevin's class, where Kevin proudly showed off how Edward could create intricate paper art with just his hands. That evening, the family had dinner with Kim, her boyfriend, and a friend. While Edward carefully sliced beef, they discussed how he wasn't charging anyone for his services. In his awkwardness, Edward accidentally flung a piece of meat into Kim's lap, leaving her furious. Later, Edward's talent extended to grooming pets. One woman asked him to groom her poodle, and word quickly spread. Soon, neighbors lined up in the Boggs' backyard with their pets, and others even requested haircuts. Peg enthusiastically let Edward style her hair too. One day, Edward went to the market with a client. There, he spotted Kim and her boyfriend sharing a kiss. This sight broke Edward's heart. His client snapped him out of his trance and brought him to a shop to sharpen his scissors. On the way back, they found Kim and her boyfriend locked out of the house. Edward quickly opened the door without damaging it. Later, Edward was invited to appear on a television show with Peg. The audience asked him about his skills in landscaping and hair styling. One woman asked if he had a girlfriend. Confused, Edward absent-mindedly reached for the microphone and got electrocuted. He fell backwards, and Kim, watching the show, felt deeply concerned for him. The next day, Esmeralda brought Edward to a beauty salon she planned to buy for his business. She gave him a tour, then tried to seduce him. She climbed onto him and began removing her clothes. Fortunately, the dressing chair tipped over, and Edward escaped, leaving behind a very disappointed Esmeralda. Edward rushed to a pizzeria where the Boggs family was waiting for him. He nervously explained what had happened at the salon, recounting how Esmeralda had undressed in front of him in the back room. The family sat in stunned silence, clearly uncomfortable with the story. Breaking the tension, Bill changed the subject and told Edward he would need a bank loan to start his own business. Peg accompanied Edward to the bank, but their hopes were quickly dashed. The banker declined the application upon discovering that Edward had no social security number, no credit history, and no collateral. Unfortunately, client testimonials weren't enough to secure a loan. The banker advised Edward to start building his credit score and try again in the future. Meanwhile, tensions were rising between Kim and her boyfriend Jim. Jim was scheming to use Edward to break into his parents' house. Kim objected, unwilling to exploit Edward's innocence, but she reluctantly joined Jim's group. They convinced Edward to pick the locks with his scissor hands. However, the house alarm was triggered, and Edward was locked inside. Panicking, the group abandoned him, and Edward was arrested by the police. Upon hearing the news, Peg and Bill rushed to the detention facility. Fortunately, Edward was released under the grounds of mental incapacity. His lawyer argued that Edward's isolation for most of his life severely limited his understanding of morality and judgment. News of Edward's arrest spread quickly through the neighborhood. Former admirers began to question his intentions and grew wary of his involvement in their gardens and hairstyles. When Peg and Edward returned home, a swarm of journalists crowded around them. Later, Kim approached Edward and tried to explain. She admitted she had tried to stop Jim and regretted everything. Tearfully, she confessed that it was Jim's parents' house, and though she didn't mean for it to happen, she had encouraged Edward to go. Before Edward could respond, Jim interrupted. He showed no remorse and instead blamed Kim. Furious, Kim walked out on him. Edward, overwhelmed by anger and confusion, scratched the walls of the house in frustration. Bill tried to offer Edward a moral lesson, but Edward gave a naive and misguided answer, revealing his struggle to understand right from wrong. Meanwhile, Esmeralda, once a devoted fan, spread a vicious rumor that Edward had tried to attack her with his hands, but she had narrowly escaped. As a result, many neighbors declined Peg's invitation to Christmas dinner. On Christmas night, Peg and Kim decorated the tree. Kim looked outside and was captivated by a wintry scene. Edward was sculpting a magnificent ice statue in the yard. As he worked, snow flurries drifted into the air. Kim danced joyfully in the falling snow, lost in the moment, until Jim shouted from afar and startled Edward. In a panic, Edward accidentally scratched Kim's palm. Peg rushed outside and brought Kim in to treat the wound. Meanwhile, Jim pushed Edward out of the Boggs' yard in a jealous rage. After Kim composed herself, she went outside again and broke up with Jim, heartbroken and unable to find Edward. Wandering through the town, Edward tore at his jumpsuit and the plants around him in a fit of sorrow. A neighbor who witnessed this called the police. Minutes later, officers arrived at the Boggs' house searching for Edward. Peg and Bill left to look for him, but Edward had already returned home alone. Kim embraced him, and he drifted into another memory. In his dream, Edward recalled the day the inventor gave him a pair of artificial hands. But before the hands could be attached, the inventor collapsed and died. In his grief, Edward had destroyed the hands, cutting them apart with his own. He awoke from the trance, fearful he might hurt Kim as well. Elsewhere, Jim and his drunken friend were speeding toward Kim's house. Along the way, they nearly hit Kevin. Edward leapt in to save him, but in the process, accidentally cut Kevin's face. Jim accused Edward of attacking him. Hearing the commotion, neighbors poured into the street. The police chased Edward, who fled back to the mansion atop the hill. Peg pleaded with the angry mob to leave him alone. A sympathetic officer fired 3 shots into the air, pretending to have killed Edward to satisfy the crowd. But some of them, skeptical, marched toward the mansion. Kim followed Edward up to the dark, abandoned mansion. She didn't realize that Jim had followed her. In the attic, Jim tried to kill Edward. Kim intervened, knocking Jim to the ground and pointing Edward's blades at him. Jim retaliated by shoving her aside. Seeing Kim hurt, Edward flew into a rage and stabbed Jim with one of his blades, sending him falling through a window to his death. Kim, heartbroken and in tears, told Edward that she loved him. When the mob arrived, she tricked them into believing that both Edward and Jim had perished in the struggle, showing them a broken artificial hand as evidence. The crowd solemnly left the mansion. Back in the present, the grandmother ends the story by revealing to the little girl that she was Kim. She never saw Edward again, but believed he was immortal and ageless. Even in her old age, she imagined Edward still living in the mansion, carving magnificent ice sculptures, each one a memory of the time she danced in the snow he created.